First story. In San Jose, December typically brought warm nights, sparkling lights, and the exuberant spirit of Christmas. But this December was not like previous ones for Charles Taylor. In sharp contrast to the joyous atmosphere that lined the streets, the air crackled with an unnerving intensity. The city was covered in a persistent fog that gave everything a ghostly, spooky hue. The typical sounds of life seemed to have been muffled by a chilly hush. Even Charles, a man of reason and logic, felt a tinge of discomfort run down his spine. A bone-chilling wind ripped through the bare limbs of the sycamore tree outside Charles's window the night before Christmas Eve. He listened to the steady creaking of the home settling as he lay awake next to his wife Sarah. He was familiar with the sound, having heard it soothe him to sleep innumerable times, but there was something evil about it tonight. Abruptly, a spine-tingling scream tore through the quiet. Sarah jolted awake, terrified and clinging to Charles. He also experienced a chilling sense of dread rising in his gut as his heart pounded against his ribs. The scream was followed by a succession of unexplained noises, including footsteps on the rickety stairs, voices that seemed to be whispering, and objects that seemed to be tumbling from shelves. Fear tightened its grasp on them like a vice, making it difficult for their logical minds to process what was happening around them. The strange noises were replaced by an even more frightening silence when the home awoke the following morning, still unnaturally silent. With his mind still spinning from the night's horrors, Charles made the decision to look into it. In an attempt to come up with a logical explanation for the unexplained activity, he searched the attic. He found a faded leather notebook among forgotten trinkets and dusty boxes. The diary he opened told a terrifying story about a young girl named Emily, who had lived in the house a century before. Her terrible death, the result of a vicious murder that went unsolved, was described in the diary. Charles realized a terrible reality as he continued reading. Emily's restless soul was still stuck in the house, her anger and sadness showing through as the frightening events they had seen. With the understanding of the troubled history of the house, Charles felt compelled to take action, desperate to find a means to placate Emily's ghost and restore harmony to the house. He started looking into local mythology and getting in touch with mediums. One night, the attic became extremely cold while a seance was being held there. Emily appeared as a shadowy apparition in the wavering candlelight. Charles talked to her in a shaky voice, expressing his condolences and understanding her grief. He pledged to use all of his resources to secure her soul's peace and seek justice for her. With the use of historical documents and Emily's journal entries, Charles set out to find the reason behind her demise. He painstakingly retraced her last days, speaking with the offspring of those who once called the village home, and pieced together the broken picture of her history. After weeks of assiduously searching, Charles eventually found a secret box with a confession letter from the guilty party inside. Armed with this fresh proof, he called the police and asked that Emily's case be reopened. Even though it took longer than expected, justice was eventually served when the offender was found, tried, and sentenced for his horrible deed. After hiding for several weeks, the fog finally lifted, revealing San Jose bathed in the warm glow of the rising sun. The air, which had been thick with terror, became lighter as the century-old tragedy was resolved. Standing hand in hand on their porch, watching the world come to life, Charles and Sarah felt their spirits lifted and their hearts lightened. The worry that had previously obscured the Christmas spirit reappeared with newfound zeal. They were aware that Emily's soul had at last found peace and had been reunited with her departed loved ones. With the haunting over, there was a sense of closure and hope for a better future. And when Charles gazed at his wife, he realized that their love would endure despite all odds, just like the lights in their house. Second story. Dallas felt the chill of December blow in, its hold growing more and more firm as the hours went by. Nancy Susan held her cup of hot chocolate tightly, even though the heat from her body was making her fingers numb. Lily and Ben, her husband John's children, gathered closer, their cheeks glowing in the firelight as he stoked the crackling fire. An unexpected burst of wind rocked the windows as midnight approached, bringing the room completely black. There was an unsettling silence as the fire flickered and eventually extinguished. The sound of John fumbling for his lighter reverberated through the silence. At last the flame sparked to life, and the walls were covered in long, hideous shadows. Whimpering, Lily hunkered down in Nancy's embrace. Ben, who was usually quite talkative, stayed remarkably silent, his eyes bulging with terror. "Just a power outage," John stammered out of his speech. "Don't worry." But Nancy couldn't shake her uneasiness. Outside, the wind howled in a melancholic chorus that sounded like it was whispering secrets into the night. She experienced a prickling sensation on her skin, as though shadowy eyes watched them. Just then, a spine-tingling scream tore through the darkness, upending the tenuous calm. It was borne by the wind and came from outside, both nearby and far away. Lily screamed, her whole body shaking violently. Ben's pallid face showed anxiety as he clung to his father. With a gleam in his eyes, John reached for a baseball bat and a flashlight. He said, "Stay here," in a forceful yet terrified voice. "I'll check it out." Nancy watched as his figure was engulfed by the darkness as he vanished into the night, torn apart by the storm. The children's whimpers and the roaring wind were the only sounds breaking the heavy, oppressive silence that had returned. Moments dragged into interminable hours. Nancy paced the room, a gnawing ache in her stomach from her nervousness. She felt the chills go down her spine at every creak in the old house and every gust of wind. And then there was another scream. Closer, louder, full with an incomprehensible fear that made her bones tingle. With her heart thumping her ribs, Nancy reached for a kitchen knife, unable to take the stillness any longer. Her voice could hardly be heard over the roar of the storm as she shouted out for John. Not a response. She was driven to action by fear. She knew she had to find him. Breathing deeply, she ventured out into the frigid night, feeling the chilly air pierce her bare flesh. She trailed the shrieks, the beam of the flashlight piercing the obscurity. With the wind ripping at her hair and the snow cutting her face, the storm raged all around her. Then she saw him. John was lying splayed in the snow, his torso twisted at an odd angle, and his face frozen in a terrified expression. Standing next to him was a shadowy creature, whose shape was constantly changing, much like smoke in the breeze. Its features were an empty void where its eyes and face should have been. Nancy realized then that this was more than simply a storm. It was something older and more evil, something more ominous. The December night had turned into a trap, a jail where they were compelled to repeatedly experience this misery, caught in a never-ending loop of hopelessness and terror. Her cry was a primal one of defiance and grief, but the roaring wind ate it up, leaving only the blackness around her to hear. Nancy gasped for air as the first signs of dawn appeared on the horizon, her body saturated in perspiration. The day and storm were the same as they were in December again. But she was prepared this time. Her young children's bodies warmed hers as she held them close. John was no longer beside her, but his memory strengthened her resolve to do what had to be done. She refused to give in to the darkness. She refused to allow them to be taken prisoner by it. Nancy strode out into the storm, the winter wind ripping at her hair, a furious determination burning in her eyes. She wouldn't be terrified this time. She'd fight this time. She was prepared to end the vicious cycle of fear, even if it meant facing the night of December as it had become her battleground. Third story. Outside, a blizzard roared, spinning snowflakes into a white vortex that engulfed everything outside the windows. Jessica and Mark, who had only been married for a month, were cuddled up by the fireplace in their comfortable Chicago apartment, the flickering fire creating long shadows that stretched over the space. Jessica excitedly read aloud from a collection of terrifying ghost stories, her eyes glimmering with anticipation at every spine-tingling turn. Mark faked a smile, sleep weighing heavily on his eyes. He normally found warmth and comfort in their shelter, so the unsettling stories stood in stark contrast. Jessica, on the other hand, adored them, her eyes glimmering with delight at every spine-tingling turn. A new sound emerged as the fire died down and the shadows became longer. It was a soft whisper that sounded as though it was being borne by the wind. The sound was faint and melancholic, hardly discernible above the flickering flames, yet oddly clear. Jessica, who has always had a fascination with the macabre, sat up, intrigued. With a shudder down her spine, she questioned, "Did you hear that?" But Mark waved it off, thinking it was only the wind playing tricks on their ears. However, the muttering became louder and more intense as the night went on. It appeared to be all about them, reverberating through the walls and circling their heads. Mark and Jessica ventured outdoors into the thick of the snow to investigate, after becoming alarmed by the unsettling sound. Their skin was pricked by sharp needles as the wind howled. Their footsteps were muffled by the thick and heavy snow. The black shapes of houses loomed all about them, their windows barren and dark. Sporadic glimpses of something lurking in the swirling snow, a dark shape, a face distorted in misery, were illuminated by the ghostly glow of the street lamps. They came to a frozen lake with a heavy coating of snow covering its surface, guided by the whispering voices. The sound of murmuring appeared to come from underneath the ice, like a choir of lost souls stuck in the freezing cold. With an audible crack, the ice suddenly cracked. One long skeletal hand came up out of the water, then another, and another. The murmurs became louder, turning into screams of agony and begs for assistance. Fearfully, Mark and Jessica stared as a ghostly creature emerged from the lake, its form obscured by ice and mist. With a skeletal finger, it gestured in their direction while its eyes glowed eerily blue. Jessica felt a wave of terror sweep over her. The terrifying stories she had read seemed all too real. She did, however, notice through the anxiety the warmth of love in Mark's eyes, a warmth that outshone the chilling danger all around them. Even though his voice was shaking, he held her hand steadily. He muttered, "We'll face this together." His words a glimmer of optimism in the shadows. With their love for one another acting as a barrier against the approaching darkness, they stood their ground together. Their voices broke through the cries as they comforted the lost souls. The ghostly apparition withdrew back into the frigid depths as the sun rose and began to shine across the frozen landscape in a golden glow. The soft chirping of birds took the place of the fading voices. Mark and Jessica stood together, their hearts blazing but their faces pallid. The snowstorm is a far-off recollection. They overcame their greatest fear and came out stronger. In the face of unspeakable suffering, their love served as a monument to the strength of human connection. Ever ingrained in their recollections, the December night's blizzard served as an odd reminder of the strength they discovered in one another, and the power of love to triumph over even the most terrifying of terrors. As they shared a kiss, they realized that no matter how dark the future would be, they would face it together, their love acting as a barrier against fear's cold grip.